nothing left to design. Another personal favourite from the years when I used to smoke, I now do not, 1933, the famous Zippo. Brilliant in its execution, and the added bonus is that when you shut it, it has that marvellous clank to it. So Humphrey Bogart, 1930s, is absolutely magic. The London Tube Man, Harry Beck, 81 years old. Never has there been, in my view, a more perfect example of information and graphics ever placed before the public that simply illustrates a very, very, very complex system. Eric Gill, London Transport Typeface, 1916. How about that for 96 years old? Still working. The underground symbol is there and recognised throughout the world. No need ever to change it. London Eye, my view, best bit of modern architecture in London, bar none. It does exactly what it says on the tin. It's a fantastic addition to the London skyline, unlike other buildings I would not mention. Maybe that will come later. The Economist Building, Alison Peter Smithson, rather, 1959, 53 years old, still a perfect example, a bit unloved at the minute, needs a bit of a clean, a perfect example of how to introduce a contemporary solution into texture and fabric of a Victorian city. If you know the building and you know the plaza in which it sits, if you don't know it, I advise you when you're in London, it's off Jermyn Street, go and see it. Another big favourite, the Seagram Building, Mies van der Rohe with Philip Johnson, 1958. That's 54 years old. Would it get any better today if it were replaced by a funny-shaped, wonky building that's very shiny? No, it wouldn't. Why would you ever do that? Interior designers among you. The Four Seasons restaurant in the base of the Seagram Building, 1959. It's 53 years old. It has never changed. It's been refreshed and repainted and repolished and bits of upholstery have changed. The basic fundamentals of that design, again, Mies and Philip Johnson were involved, has not changed. Guggenheim, perfect example in 1937 of how you create a kind of iconic, interesting building that actually does work as a gallery. What's that, 75 years old? Would you change it? Never in a million years. It works as a gallery. Unlike one recent gallery that was introduced to the architectural press to great acclaim, the first line of the review I read, talking about this fantastic building and marvellous how clever the architect was. Well, of course, it doesn't work as a gallery. What the fuck is the point? What is the point? Sorry, I promised I wouldn't swear. I have been trying very hard. I'm not a great fan of Corbusier. This building, though, I think is one of his best. Again, it says all that it needed to say in 1929, and today it still has the same validity, the same freshness, the same character as it had then. Would you want to replace it? Never. Another favourite, Mises Barcelona Pavilion, 1929. That's 83 years old. Just look at it, 83 years old. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant in shape, in form, in use of materials, the notion of light and water. You would never want to change it, and that is also followed by, guess what? 83 years old again. We still specify it, we still use it, we still like to see it. It's not that comfortable to sit in, actually. But in terms of a piece of lobby sculpture, I'd rather prefer this than other things that I have seen. Anyway, that's a kind of counter through some images that I have used or selected to support the creed that I am an absolutely passionate adherent to. But ultimate longevity. My winner for the Ultimate Longevity Award is something that everyone in this room has, one or many of, everyone in this country, everyone in this continent, everyone possibly in the world. has one or many of. It was invented centuries ago. It's still in use every day. You all used it today, and will use it tonight, and every other day and every other night in your careers. Simplicity itself, and it is... I rest my case. Thank you very much for listening.
Patrick. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick, eventually. Yes, please, possibly slightly even more uncomfortable than the Mies van der Rohe Barcelona chairs, but here we are.
Is my mic working?
Yeah.
Should play. Please take a well-earned sip. I'd like to just start off, before we delve into some of the detail of your presentation, to just ask you, list some of the projects obviously you listed in your presentation, as well as those that I talked about in the introduction. Which of those would you describe as the groundbreakers, the ones that really sort of were your lucky break that set up Reardon Smith or pushed you into a new direction without making it too long?
Montenegro, Porto Montenegro would certainly be the first. We won that as a result of an international competition.
When was that?
About 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
For those who don't know about the history of the site, it's a redundant Yugoslav Navy base that was purchased by a Canadian billionaire called Peter Monk and a syndicate of his very, very, very rich friends, with the notion of converting it to a world-class marina for super yachts. The location itself had been a naval base since Roman times. We won it. It was the largest thing that we had ever done. I mean, in size it still is. It propelled us from doing a building into doing a town.
And how did you think, why did you win that?
I think the way that we did the research on the Four Seasons in Baku. We weren't very familiar with the Adriatic or its history. We just did an amazing amount of research, and we looked at Kotor, we looked at Dubrovnik, and we looked at most of the towns in that region on the coast, and tried to understand how they were put together, how they grew organically. And then we tried to replicate that organic growth, still with kind of fairly contemporary precepts of organisation, into the master plan that we prepared. And very fortunately, we came out on top.
Do you think in a way, because you weren't from the Adriatic coast and you didn't have the experience and you did have to do the research, put you ahead of perhaps the local competition, who I'm sure were fiercely interested in getting that project?
To the best of my knowledge, or we didn't quiz our part, I don't think there was any local competition. There were 1 or 2 major European practices, but the majority of our competition came from North America. The identity of the cloud body was based in Canada. And from what I hear, I didn't see any of the entries, from what I hear, their submissions were very elegant and distinguished, owed more to kind of North American town planning than it did to what is sort of indigenous, or should be indigenous, in this part of the world.
And you mentioned a couple of times about not producing or reproducing a pastiche of what's there. How, on the other hand, you did a lot of research, and yet you don't want to redo the research. How did you make sure that it's not a pastiche on the basis of why bother doing the research if you don't then actually replicate it?
Well, research gives you a foundation that tells you where to start. Otherwise, you're kind of floating around in a European housing exercise. The research told us about volume, about the number of stories, about the way windows were detailed, the way cornices were detailed, how over the years, in an organic fashion, landscape introduced itself to these towns. When Dubrovnik, for example, was planned, there was no wonderful kind of landscape plan, it just grew. By being advised by that kind of attitude, we were able to interpret that to give us a solution, which thankfully has proved to be accurate, of what the town should be, how it should be organised, how the building should be, without necessarily meticulously copying stuff which exists.
But in the Four Seasons Baku, you said you were running around the sort of these Belle Epoque buildings in Europe, taking precise measurements.
Yeah.
Is that by the way, is that a new build from scratch?
From scratch, yes.
Okay. So is that not a sort of a real sort of duplication of what you've seen?
No, not at all. Different brief completely, because for the first...
Not a duplication of Porto Montenegro, but a duplication of, I'm thinking of some of those lovely hotels down there.
No, it was not an interpretation of the kind of Belle Epoque form of architecture. It was a direct copy, because that's what our client wanted. And therefore, we did this big survey so that we could directly copy what had previously been done. We weren't reinterpreting it, we weren't giving a different sort of twist to it.
So this level of research, which I don't think is as uncommon necessarily in the industry, is that the way that Reardon Smith defines itself, or how are you different? Why are you different from other specialist hotel architectural practices?
Vanity forbids me from providing a true answer to that, but no, to be serious, I think it's the genesis of Reardon Smith was probably my many years at the sharp end of the hotel industry in terms of working within hotel companies. And in my work within those companies, I did time behind the front desk, I did time in the kitchen, I did time as a porter, I did time as housekeeping. We kind of, I think based on my experience, we have a profound knowledge of how a hotel works, how it should be put together, and ultimately how it makes its money. And the reason we exist is that I decided eventually to come home from America and come back to the UK. In my time at Hyatt, I would, and prior to that Holiday Inn International, I would frequently come back through the UK and Europe looking for architectural design practices which in my opinion had credible hotel experience, and oftentimes simply couldn't find them. And I would always have to go back to the States and employ American architects with whom I had worked and who did have what I deemed to be credible hotel experience. So when I decided to get off aeroplanes and come home, that was the gap in the market which we shut our eyes, jumped into, and hoped all would turn out well. We started with no work. Each one of us scraped a bit of cash together. I had to borrow my bit of cash. It was a bit of a leap. None of us were in the full flush of youth at the time. But inshallah, it worked.
Okay. Now, if we move perhaps onto the presentation, some of the aspects you covered there, particularly with regard to sustainability and this idea that the ultimate in sustainability is longevity, which I think most of us would agree with. Perhaps not. Some people might have arguments or questions they'd like to raise to that comment, so please have a little think about that. You mentioned there sort of timeless design and the need to only design things once. I would challenge you by saying I think that's very boring to be limiting yourself by so-called timeless design. Is there really such a thing?
Well, I hope I gave you a number of hastily put together images of what I think answers perfectly your question. However would you be bored with an Eames chair and a footstool? It's not physically possible to be bored by that. It's just
I think
brilliant.
People would argue against that because it's nothing new.
Would anyone be bored owning an Eames chair?
Yeah, but if you had
No. I'm not talking about a single piece of furniture, but amongst your great holdings of furniture, would you be bored having an Eames chair?
Yeah, but if I saw an Eames chair in every place I went to, in every reception, I will probably be bored. I mean, I will sit on it once, be very uncomfortable, and then want to have something else. And then, you know, I think it's only natural to have a maybe to strive to have a classic design, but whether you want to see it everywhere, that's another question.
Think of the Arne Jacobsen egg chair. You're seeing that in estate agents' offices in London. You see it in every other hotel. Motel 1 have it in all their lobbies. Now you see it. Who wants it? No one. It's become too ubiquitous, and there's too many of them. It may still be a timeless design, but I think what my view there on timelessness and the fact that I rate that to be boring is that you're stifling creativity, you're stifling innovation by saying if you only have to design a big pencil once.
No.
We'll all be out of a job, and I don't think people want that.
No, I don't want to be out of a job, trust me. No, I think I obviously didn't get this idea across. I'm not in remotely suggesting that we should stop designing anything and just rely on that which previous architects and very clever people have designed. No, continue designing things, but continue designing things that when you look at them, they are not simple examples of what is currently fashionable and popular. Try and envisage what is going to happen in the next 5, 10 or 15 years. Look at a building. This is I get on another hobby horse here, which I promised God I wouldn't. But,
Go on.
Look at a Zaha Hadid building in 20 years' time and tell me how it will have weathered.
Which particular building? Which particular building?
Anyone, take your pick. They're all
Maxi.
Yeah, that's the wonderful art gallery that actually doesn't work very well as an art gallery. So that was the comment I read, and it was one that was close to my heart. Where architecture, urban architecture particularly, seems to have been reduced to an exercise in creating complicated urban sculpture where the function of the building, if considered at all, is entirely secondary.
Just one thought, and I might be a bit controversial here.
Please do.
I do agree with you when you talk about products that last. I believe that design. I love Eames, I love Jacobsen, Philip Johnson. I think as human beings, we do love a bit of longevity, but we also have a very superficial trait of character where we like a bit of fashion, something that we're going to have because it's a response to an emotion, something that we know is not going to last, and we know we want to change a bit. Our clothes, for instance. We love to have some classics, but we love to update them with things that won't last, perhaps, but it's part of the fun, don't you think?
I do, but if you subscribe to the notion of sustainability and the sensitive use of our planet's resources, one should, I propose, limit the amount of those resources that are used. Therefore, as I said earlier a moment ago, I'm not in any way advocating a stop or a cessation of design. That goes on. But look at something with a longer view than currently it is looked at. Now, if I buy a pair of shoes, a pair of trousers, or you buy a nice frock or a scarf, that will wear out and it will need to be replaced. Good, that's a good thing. If I have a regiment of Eames lounge chairs in my house, I may want something different. Doubt it, but I may. I keep one and flog the rest, make a fortune. But it's just a viewpoint I take if you subscribe to the notion of sustainability, which was the introduction to my creed, to my thesis. Because no one, unless any very clever person in this room can do it for me, no one has given me a definition of sustainability that I can understand. I don't know what it means. And my criticism is that it's used in kind of a blanket, kind of non-thinking form, just to prove how green we are, when we don't really understand.
Let's move on briefly then with regard to this idea of sustainability. With regard to what you're saying, really sound to me like they're leaders rather than followers. Are you principled enough to turn down business on the basis that an owner will not adopt a sustainable initiative that you propose, or are you just doing the minimum to cover the legal requirements?
Turning down work is in the age in which we live is a very difficult thing to do. And as I mentioned to you about a potential project in Albania, we did turn it down, and the fee on offer was in the millions, and I wasn't remotely interested. We genuinely try to embody whatever principles of efficient and sensitive use of resources our buildings entail. We try as hard as we ever can. There are some times when clients do demand a solution that is in contravention of that, and then it's up to our consciences to decide what we do. We haven't thus far faced that ultimate battle. I hope we never do, because I hope our clients are equally as committed to these ideals as we are.
I mean, looking at that, budget-wise, there's not always enough time or money, rather, to pay for sort of well thought-through design, and indeed the quality materials and the workmanship required to install those materials, and then going on with maintaining them.
Mm-hmm.
You've done a lot of work in the luxury sector.
Yep.
How do you see that panning out in the mid-market and budget sector? This idea of the longevity and the smartness of design.
I don't see there's any difference in the creed across any aspect of our industry. I think the creed, as I have crudely called it, could and should apply to anything we do, whether it's a Travelodge or another Savoy.
I mean, take the Travelodge in Waterloo that you do. I mean, you know, the owner, were they happy to take ideas as solutions, for example, with regard to materials that maybe have a life of 12 or 15 years rather than a 7-year replacement life?
Yes, they were.
And pay the extra for that?
Absolutely, they were.
So how do you go about convincing owners? And I'm thinking here of the big guys, the Axios, Blackstone guys, Pandox, who really are the owners who don't really care about design. They want to make a turn on a building, buy it, tart it up, move on to the next one. And I think of the Hilton in Prague, where we were a few years ago, that's an Axios property. These guys, they're not interested in longevity of design. They want to dress it all up, flog it on to the next guy, and leave the longevity, the sustainability ideas to the next owner.
Absolutely.
And how do you deal when Blackstone or Pandox, for example, I'm not saying that they're the only bad guys out there, in fact they're not that bad either, really, but how do you deal with that? How do you convince an owner to adopt meaningful and long-lasting design? Pay your fees.
And pay our fees, which are very modest. But by using every device of persuasion and example that we